Welcome to Books in the Freezer, a podcast dedicated to the deliciously disturbing world of horror fiction. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Devin, and today we're giving you guys the floor as we answer some questions from you, the listeners.
This episode of Books in the Freezer is brought to you by Audible. This podcast wouldn't be possible without audiobooks. So if you want some spooky stories told by some familiar voices, try Stephen King's Pet Sematary, read by Dexter's Michael C. Hall, or The Dead Zone, read by James Franco, or podcast favorite Joe Hill's Nosferatu, read by Kate Mulgrew. For a free audiobook and 30-day trial, go to audibletrial.com/booksinthefreezer. Happy listening. So a few weeks ago, we put a call out on social media for anyone to submit questions for our Q&A episode, and we did get a couple questions. So we're going to be answering the questions we got from Instagram in response to our Instagram stories and our Instagram post and our Facebook post.
A couple being quite an understatement. If you don't hear a question here, we do apologize, but this won't be the last time we do a Q&A episode.
All right, so starting off with questions from Instagram, and I'm sorry if I butcher usernames. Like, Instagram usernames are like a weird, like, what's that game where like all the words are squished together and you have to like try to find what the words are?
What? Boggle?
Boggle. Yeah, like that's how Instagram usernames are for me, and I feel like I always mess them up.
Wow.
So our first question comes to us from @Melissaw3, who asks, who's the most disturbed / scariest character you've encountered while reading horror?
That's quite a difficult question. I've been racking my brain trying to just fathom all of the characters that I've read that would be described as disturbing. For me, I think it's kind of a toss-up between two. One, not necessarily from a horror novel, but that would be Tyler Durden from Fight Club.
Interesting.
Because, my God, that man is absolutely insane, and when you know more about who he is, it's even worse. In the sense of being disturbed, I think he's probably one of the more disturbed characters I've read, and it's, again, the first one that kind of came to mind. However, when in terms of like disturbing and being scary, I think, at least at this point in time, I would probably give that to Alex from A Clockwork Orange.
Oh, that's a good answer.
That guy is disturbed, but also disturbing in the sense of I really would never want to come face to face with him. How about you?
For a book, I would really have to say Joe from You, and just because he is disturbing, but he hides it all behind this facade of normalcy and charm, and the things he does to Beck and the way he manipulates her life and stalks her. He just has all of these excuses and just plays everything off and is just so manipulative, you know, under this whole like nice guy. If I'm going to go with like disturbing, I am going to have to go with probably a movie character. I'm going to go with Henry from Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, Michael Rooker.
I was going to ask who, but then you said Michael Rooker, and then I'm like, oh, okay, yep, I can see that.
And when you're reading you're reading it from Joe's perspective, and you as the reader also find him charming. So it's just like, wow, am I also under your spell? Are you actually like kind of funny?
So the next question comes from Christina M. Wilder, and that is, what sort of horror genre would you like to see more of?
I would like to see more female coming of age stories, like, you know, like a girl group, someone looking back at their childhood and maybe something that happened a specific summer, but from a female perspective and with like a female group of friends. I feel like when we have these stories, you know, they're usually like the Stand By Me and It, and I know we have Beverly and It. I would just like to see more of those stories from a female perspective. I just think it's something we don't have a ton of.
I actually find this question really hard as well, because I find it's so much easier to say what there's too much of in a horror genre. It's kind of harder to look on it and say, all right, what do we need more of? Truth be told, I don't think I have an answer for this one. I think I've kind of been well served in a lot of what I enjoy about horror. Basically, my horror tastes are very eclectic. I don't necessarily gravitate towards a certain like story type, I guess. it is a lot more commonplace to talk about the genres that are overserved, and there's too much of them. To reflect back on what we would like to see more of. I honestly would like to just see more of the same in terms of genres. Like, I love psychological horror, especially first person stories with semi unreliable narrators, things like this. That's kind of my wheelhouse when it comes to writing as well as reading. So I would love to see more of that. These are my favorite kind of stories to read, but the horror genre, I think, especially in terms of indie publishing, there's an abundance of pretty much any kind of horror you can think of. So I do find it a little difficult to answer the question of what I like to see more of. I wish more of the niche genres were easier to find.
Our next question comes to us from at Brit_Jones87. She says, to Stephanie, when do you read, watch horror TV/movies, listen to audiobooks, do your horror research when you have a young one at home? I'm a stay-at-home mom of one with a killer chilling obsession galore, but find no time to indulge without the kiddo seeing/hearing. How do you do it? Teach me. From one horror-loving mama to another. Help. Well, I'm not gonna lie. It's difficult. Sometimes it's just me watching something on my phone, like while folding laundry, while my son's watching something on the big TV. That's not horror. It's a little more appropriate. As for audiobooks, I work a part-time job at night that lets me use headphones, so I do get to listen to some audiobooks at work, which I realize is not possible for everyone. I also try to like squeeze a couple hours of audiobooks, while doing something like folding laundry or doing dishes. It is understandable because just having a little one at home, just finding time to do stuff like that is a little more difficult, especially when you don't want to scar or traumatize your children for life. So I understand. Hopefully some of that helps.
So the short answer is audiobooks.
Audiobooks, yeah. Or like sometimes I have just like my own screen playing something. While my child is distracted. This was so much easier when my son took naps, because then I'm like, oh, I have a 2-hour block of time where I could watch a scary movie. Or when my son was like a baby and didn't understand what was going on or even really care. But yeah, now that he's older and he finds a lot of things scary. Like, we tried to watch Jurassic Park, way too scary for him. We tried to watch Jumanji. He was way too scared of it. So as you can imagine, it's a little tougher for me to like squeeze in more time to do that. She has a second part of the question that is for both of us. That is, do either of you have any trigger warnings or things you can't handle? For example, I can't handle children being harmed abusively or sexually in some movies, TV/lit. Maybe it comes from being a mama. I can handle it and Nosferatu, but can't handle the pedophile-ish flashback scenes in Split. Anyways, do you guys have something that's a no-no in horror? Mine's probably, yeah, like death of a child, a kidnapping, harm to children. But even so, like, I can read stuff like that. It really just depends on how it's handled. Like, Devin and I read Pet Sematary together, and I was a little nervous going into it because I know that the plot revolves around the death of a child. But even the way it was handled there, we kind of get like a lead up to the moment and then way after. So I felt like in that case, it was a little easier to handle. At the moment, I can't think of anything that would keep me from picking up a book. But I know I'm a little more hesitant if I know it involves harm to children. But I'll still give it a try.
For those that have been listening to the podcast since I've joined, I'm pretty sure I've developed a bit of a reputation of kind of being maybe desensitized a little bit. Like, basically all of my picks are room temperature, essentially, with very few fridge picks. I'm trying to preface my answer so that it doesn't sound like I'm trying to be very macho and beating my chest, but I don't really have any trigger warnings, subject matter, or something like that I can't handle, in the same sense that I don't necessarily get like scared overly from a lot of horror stuff as well. It just doesn't, I find I can get immersed in a story, but I don't find myself getting to that degree. When I come across subject matter that is very sensitive, very close to the chest for me, for example, this is going to relate to movies and, like, I guess TV, but I had a really, really good friend of mine pass away from cancer years ago, and there were times when watching movies with cancer patients and cancer treatment, stuff like this, would kind of get me to well up, and it was really difficult to watch, but it wouldn't deter me from going into it. Trigger warnings are a wonderful thing from being harmed, essentially, psychologically and emotionally from media and from work. But when I come across subject matter of that nature, I still kind of dive in and kind of shoulder it. Those kind of things I like facing head on, even as, you know, bad as it probably is for me in the moment. I find long term it's helped me with this kind of approach to this kind of thing. When it comes to trigger warnings in general, especially with this podcast, with reading horror and talking to friends about horror, I try to be aware of the trigger warnings because I know there are people that are incredibly sensitive to it, and I know there are people that you'd want to make them aware of this going into it. So, like I said, I try to be aware of them, but as far as personal reading, personal consumption of the media, there really isn't anything I can think of right now that would deter me. The next question comes from, I believe, Train to Midian, and they ask, do you ever have nightmares?
I actually do have nightmares. Not often. They come like every once in a while, but I do. I had one actually like a few weeks ago. It was like a home invasion one. I went like, you'll be proud, I went all final girl, and I ended up fighting the guy with a broken bottle.
Wow.
Yep. This is obviously a dream because I don't think I'd ever have the courage to do that. And then I had like a kidnapping nightmare after I watched The Devil's Candy, even though like that scene is like nothing in the whole movie. It's like maybe a 10-minute sequence out of the whole movie. And I guess it scared me because I had a nightmare very similar to the situation in the movie, like immediately after. So yeah, I do get nightmares. So how about you, Devin? You ever get nightmares?
Nightmares is actually quite an interesting part of my life.
Okay.
I don't actually have nightmares per se, that I can think of in the last, like, say 15, 20 years or so, but I do vividly remember like a handful of nightmares I had as a kid. But I mean, where, again, to talk about my writing, I did a lot of diving into like lucid dreaming and dream manipulation and controlling of nightmares and things like this. So like, yeah, I'm absolutely fascinated by just the idea of nightmares.
Have you ever done it?
What, lucid dream?
Yeah.
I have.
I did it once.
I can't like do it on command like every night, but that would be such an amazing thing. And for those, you know, unaware, lucid dreaming is when you can wake up kind of in your dream and realize it's a dream, and then you kind of have control over things. You can manipulate things. I love just thinking about nightmares. I love thinking about dreams and stuff like this. This is why I, again, base my writing on this kind of stuff.
Do you want to hear my funny story about lucid dreaming?
That would be awesome.
I was in high school and I had a crush on a guy who lived like 3 doors down from me. And I was dreaming, and in my dream, he was like talking to me and we were flirting. And even in my dream, I was like, this is obviously a dream because this guy has no idea that I exist and I am dreaming. So now I'm going to fly. Bye.
Wow. That's awesome. See, the hardest part, the reason why a lot of people can't lucid dream, like, again, on command, is generally in your dream, the realization that you're dreaming is enough to wake you up. Like, the shock of, oh my God, this is a dream, will actually pop you out of the dream and you'll wake up in your bed. But that sounds awesome. You were somewhat insecure enough to the point that you end up lucid dreaming. That's great.
Yeah, it helped that one time. Oh man. So Rachel, our old co-host, wants to know, what is one of your favorite quotes from a horror book? What are your top 3 horror subgenres to read? And is there a horror topic that you are nervous or intimidated to cover on the podcast?
I am not one for quotes.
I don't think I've done a good job of keeping track of quotes from horror books that have stood out to me. So I'm probably just going to go with a classic answer, and that is the opening line to Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there walked alone. In the series, they also like read that in one of the openings, which is cool. Top 3 horror subgenres to read. I do love possession stories. So like possessions, last exorcism, I guess. I love haunted houses. You know, we've talked about that. I also really like vampires. I think all things that I have mentioned on the show previously, things that will come as a surprise to absolutely no one. And is there a topic that we are nervous or intimidated to cover? Personally, a little nervous / intimidated to cover cosmic horror. I'm currently reading some H.P. Lovecraft to have a little more confidence when we finally decide to do that episode. And then there's some that are just really big and vast that we haven't done. Like we haven't done an episode on like ghosts.
I am horrible with quotes in the sense of, you know, I can read something and find a line kind of intriguing, but then continue to read and then forget where it is and never really go back to it. So, like, I'm not one of the people that will quote things very often, per se, without looking it up first. The podcast is making it better. I'm getting more aware of that and keeping track of things better. A quote that comes from again, my favorite novel. I read this novel basically every year, which is Bram Stoker's Dracula. The quote comes from Mina, who is what I believe to be a very strong heroine of the story, talking about Lucy, who is her friend who succumbs to the thralls of Dracula. I told her how anxious I was about Jonathan and that she tried to comfort me, and then the quote was, well, she succeeded somewhat, for though sympathy can't alter facts, it can make them more bearable. Just that, like, it's poignant for me. It's basically saying that, you know, you can comfort somebody, you can make somebody feel better. It doesn't change their situation, but it can certainly help them deal with it and make it, again, more bearable. And I just like the way that it was phrased. It sounds very poetic when I read it. It's not scary, but it's powerful.
Yeah.
And the top 3 horror subgenres to read. For me to read, indie doesn't count as a subgenre. The top one is not going to be a subgenre. It's going to be a style. And Steph might be able to guess before I even say it, because if something is written in this style, I am going to read it and recommend it, whether it's good or bad. And that is anything epistolary.
Yep, knew it.
A horror novel done in epistolary format is going to get my attention. So I would be remiss not to put that as the top subgenre of sorts to read. Beyond that, I'm going to get a very ironic sound from Steph, a groan, when I say I honestly still think zombies would fit within this.
It's just a shrug, not a groan.
Okay. I know zombies are overdone. I know zombies are oversaturated now, and every indie author, especially with a vague idea of what horror is writing a zombie novel. But I still feel like zombies are some of the purest way of storytelling in the genre, because it's one of the monsters where very rarely are they the focus of the story. They are a setting, they are a backdrop. And when you find authors that can grasp that part of the genre, where they're not trying to focus on making the zombie scary, but they're focused on telling a really, really intense story with the people that are alive, then I think it's some more powerful works. Honestly, I could probably use a little more sci-fi horror in my life.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one.
Not like cosmic horror specifically, because cosmic horror kind of fits within a subgenre of sci-fi horror. But like something like an Event Horizon or a Dead Space, a derelict ship. Yeah, I could totally use some more sci-fi horror in my life. And Creepy Caffeine asked, do you have opinions on what subgenre of horror overdone and what, on the other hand, you wish there was more of? Also, do you have a favorite film, television show adaptation that you felt did the book justice? We did kind of answer the first one already. in terms of stuff that are overdone, I think I even mentioned it in my answer just then, where I do think zombies are an overdone part of the genre. I think a lot of the staples are done. Like, a lot of the main ones are overdone. Zombies, vampires.
I would have to agree with zombies. I think especially when you start looking at indie horror and start looking for stuff there's just so many zombies.
Yeah, that's fair.
Also, to agree with you on your last answer, I do wish there was more sci-fi horror. I really enjoy sci-fi horror, and especially like space horror, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
So I definitely wish there was more of that.
And for a favorite film and or television show adaptation,
I really liked The Ruins, the adaptation of the Scott Smith book about the American tourists going to Mexico and getting trapped on some ruins. I also thought the recent adaptation of Gerald's Game was pretty good on Netflix. So those are two that have stood out for me that I thought really did the book justice.
okay, you did kind of take my pick with Gerald's Game,
Oh no, I'll.
but no, there are a number. To keep it on King, and to really be loose with the term "did the book justice," because
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think a one-to-one adaptation is doing the book justice per se. Where novels, fiction are different medium than film. You know, there you have to make concessions for that. So, like, for an example, The Shining. The Shining, I feel, was a great adaptation that did do the book justice in terms of tone, in terms of the feeling you get watching it / reading it. Whereas the Shining miniseries done by Stephen King was more on beat with everything that happened in the novel, and it was kind of laughably bad. However, to answer it non-Stephen King, and this might be controversial as well in a way, but I think the Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of Dracula was really well. They did change some things around. It wasn't, like I said, perfect. They gave Dracula this weird origin story that was just odd. But overall, I think it was a really well done adaptation of the novel. And seeing the movie is what made me originally go and read the novel and fall in love with it in the first place. So, again, I would be wrong to not at least mention it here. The only criminal thing with that adaptation I found, besides the weird Dracula lovesick origin story, is
I know what you're gonna say.
Keanu Reeves' accent.
Yep.
Oh my god, that was horrible.
So bad. I love Keanu Reeves,
But
no.
Sir Anthony Van Helsing was more than mixed up for that.
So at Pandemonium Peach wants to know, are there any books you haven't talked about on the podcast because it hasn't fit with any themes, but you'd really like to talk about it? And yeah, there's definitely a few, and it's one of those things where like, I know Rachel and I would talk about this a lot. Well, we would read a book and be like, so, okay, someday in the near future when we do this, like, obscure episode, this will be a perfect fit for it. Like, I know I read, I think it's Mary's All in a Row by Gwendolyn Keist. And I'm like, someday when we do, like, an urban legends horror episode, like, that'll be a perfect fit for something like that. Or something like The Fetishists by A.S. Coomer. I'm like, oh, when we do like body horror, that's going to be one of my picks. So it's like things like that where I do read them and I'm like, I want to talk about them, but I have to wait for like the time when we finally do that perfect episode that just fits it perfectly. How about you?
I am an incredibly slow reader. And after doing the podcast for what, the 8 months or so that I've been on it, I've kind of caught up with pretty much most of what I've read. So I'm at a point now where I'm kind of reading things within the couple of weeks before the episode to get a recommendation for everyone. There are a couple that I've read that I haven't talked about. One would be The Summer Job, Adam Caesar. That is one that I'm hoping to fit into an episode at some point within the next year or so. There's House of Small Shadows by Adam Neville. That hasn't fit in with anything that we've talked about so far, but
Not yet.
we'll see what happens. And then in terms of body horror, I've read a David Cronenberg book that I would like to talk about at some point called Consumed, which was a very interesting book that I'm really looking forward to talking about. But not so much a lot of them, but there are a few. And Quincy Bear 69. How extreme do you like your horror on a scale of 1 to 5?
I'd say like a 3.5. I think when it starts getting like too extreme, I feel like it just loses something for me. It's just not my jam. If you like extreme horror, like that's totally fine. I don't feel like it's quite my jam, but I think closer to 1, I kind of feel like okay, give me a little more than that. 3.5.
With me, it's again contingent on your definition of extreme. Like the extreme horror kind of really niche subgenre is very gore centric, very disturbing, like somewhat torture porn of the horror genre. So in terms of that kind of extremity, I'm actually probably closer like at 2, 2.5. I appreciate scenes of gore and scenes of extreme violence in terms of storytelling when they're amplifying the story, but a lot of times with the genre of extreme horror, if that's what we're referring to specifically, it's more of the story as a backdrop for the violence. So it really isn't it really isn't my taste. I've read a few titles like that, and they were okay. Like I didn't dislike them per se, but it's just not what I would immediately reach for in terms of looking for something to consume just for entertainment purposes. I like the scenes when they're done really well and they can be very impactful, but they need to be complement or be a supplement for the story, and not the other way around where the story is just there to get you from scene 1 to scene 2 of the extremeness. So yeah, I'd say 2, maybe 2.5 out of 5 would be where I would like.
I never would have thought my answer would be higher than yours.
I know.
Our next question is from @UncleBeefstock. Okay. What is your least favorite book of all time?
Okay, so I'm not sure if this is cheating, and Uncle Beefstock, if you meant your least favorite horror book, then message me or reach out and I will answer it independently. I used to run a group on YouTube that seeked out stories we don't expect to enjoy to read and read them.
Oh, I remember this.
It was called Are We Not Entertained? It's still the Goodreads group. I might actually, revive that at some point. But we actively looked for books we didn't expect to enjoy just to read them and see what we can pull from them.
Throne of Glass is the one I remember you complaining about the most.
Oh, God, did I ever. Again, I apologize if you meant least favorite horror book, but my least favorite book I have ever read is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. Oh, my God. Before me and Steph were even friends, she has heard me complain about this book. It is absolutely, like, I'm losing words just thinking about it, actually. I try and cut Maas some slack on it because she was incredibly young when she wrote this originally, apparently. I can't go into more detail than that without raging, and no one wants to see that.
I have like 2, and yeah, neither of them are horror. I just DNF books. Like I think the lowest I've rated anything the last couple years is 2 stars, and that means like I did not enjoy this, but I finished it. Like if I hate something, I do not finish it and just like delete it from my Goodreads and my life and my eyesight. It's just how I do. Oh, but a few years ago, I read She's Come Undone by Wally Lamb, which in the 90s was this really big Oprah book club. And it's just tragedy porn. I hate tragedy porn. And it follows this fat girl named Dolores, and her being fat is a big part of the story and is like half of the tragedies that she goes through. And trigger warnings for like sexual assault and rape and all of these things happen to her. And that's just the whole book. The whole book is just horrible things happening to her. And I'm like, you almost become desensitized to it halfway through the book because just every time like it looks like things are going to get better, they don't, and something else bad happens to her. And I remember just not liking it. Also, there were so many reviews where it's like, wow, he really understands how to write women. And I just felt like that could not be further from the truth in my opinion. And obviously I don't speak for all women. All women are different. Maybe it really resonated with some women. I did not find that that was the case. And it was one of those things where she's this like fat lady, and I remember he said like a specific weight because she was supposed to be very young, and I think she weighed like 250 pounds as a teenager. And it said like she got into a car and like the car like sunk on her side. I'm like, I don't think that would happen at that weight. It was just like things that just didn't make sense. Like a man who didn't understand women's bodies or sizes and just piled on all these tragedies on a woman and called it a story. And people loved it, I guess, in the 90s. Not my deal at all. My second one was a book I had to read in high school called A Separate Peace by John Knowles, and that was a boring piece of crap, and I threw it across the room. I was so mad and underwhelmed, and it was weirdly sensational and overdramatic and underwhelming at the same time. I don't know how it did it, but it did it, and I despise that book.
Don't sugarcoat it, Steph. You chucked it across the room.
Yes, I did. I also did that with another book. I've only done that like twice. But yeah. Anyway, that's my answer for that. So, at Teresa Contour wants to know, do either of you read Jack Kilbourne? Do you consider his books horror? His book, Afraid, was the first book I read as an adult. His books can be graphic. If you have read them, what are your thoughts on his writing? I have not read Jack Kilbourne. In fact, this is the first time I've heard of him. So, Devin, you want to take it from here?
I haven't actually read any Jack Kilbourne, no. He's an author that keeps popping up when I'm looking for new books. So he keeps getting recommended to me from Amazon, so I've always been wanting to do it. Steph, you might enjoy it. Like, he's also a thriller writer, because he writes Jack Kilbourne as his horror, and J.A. Conrath is his thriller novels. But yeah, I have a copy of Webcam before I realized that it was like really deep into his collection. So I do plan to read some Jack Kilbourne. Afraid actually is probably going to be the one I pick up first. And that's one that I might end up talking about actually on a future episode. It's this is one we'll put a pin in, and we'll get back to it on an episode proper in the future. Next up, we have Laura Lee Conway, who asks, what's a book you'd like to see adapted for television or film?
I'd really like to see Exorcist Falls by Jonathan Janz adapted for film. Here's the thing, though. You need the novella Exorcist Road to give context for the novel Exorcist Falls. And we just had the show The Exorcist come out a few years ago. And that also took place in Chicago and also followed like a upper middle class family that had a possessed child. So I think maybe at this exact moment might be too soon because it takes place in kind of the same area. Exorcist Falls is very different from that, but I think Exorcist Road might be a little too similar to the Exorcist TV show. I'm talking about this like it's really going to happen. Like I'm meeting with executives tomorrow. I think that would be great as like a horror miniseries. I think just all the twists and turns it takes. And there's some scenes like I still think about from that book that I think would translate really well. Also, Come Closer by Sarah Gran, I think would make a really good horror miniseries.
Well, for me, first one I'm going to mention off the hop, and this is for Books in the Freezer Bingo, is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady.
Oh, yeah, that would be great.
Hasn't that been optioned?
It is. I mean, I have a hard time keeping up with like where things are in the development process. But like when we talked to him, it seemed like it was a go.
Yeah. So My Best Friend's Exorcism is definitely one I want to see. But that one is not so much as hypothetical as others because I do believe that may have been optioned or it's in the works or something along those lines. So that is definitely one of the first ones that came to mind. The other one, for anyone who knows me, this is not going to be a surprise, but I would love to see Zeburbia by Jake Bible made into either a movie or a TV show or whatever, because just it would be like The Walking Dead, but funny and entertaining. Ooh, I probably shouldn't say that. Yeah, I don't think it would ever happen because there is The Walking Dead and the zombie television show where the zombie movie is kind of a very oversaturated market right now, but I would love to see like Jay Sanford and Elspeth and all them on the screen. That would be awesome.
At Jennifer Maloney wants to know what first got you into horror books and what was the first horror book you read?
What first got me into horror books was just an obsession with horror in general. Being a preteen and watching Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th, and then going to school and reading these boring books. Then realizing that there were books kind of like these movies I'm watching. That sounds cool.
I mean, I, like most people, was there for the big Goosebumps craze. Like, I remember I was an early reader. Like, I learned to read at when I was 4. So when I was in like first grade and we took our class field trip down to the school library, I was checking out Goosebumps chapter books. And I was just, yeah, it was just an immediate, like I was immediately drawn to them. And I think it was a choose your own adventure one. I definitely got into horror books before horror movies. Yeah. Like most kids, just Goosebumps. Also, you want to hear something funny? When I was in high school, like my family was like very religious and I was at this religious school. So I remember actually reading Christian horror. This is a thing. And specifically, there was a book called House, and it was co-authored, I remember, by Ted Decker and Frank Peretti. And it was about like all these people that get drawn into this like decrepit old motel and have to stay there the night, and they get like confronted with like things from their past, and there's like ghosts and stuff.
You just reminded me that Ted Decker exists. I knew.
Yeah.
I've read The Bowman's Daughter.
Oh, that's what like the edgy Christian kids were into.
Nice. I forgot about that. Oh, wow.
Matthew Boyette wants to know, I love horror books, but my first love is comic books / graphic novels. There's been an ever increasing rise in production of these books. Do you have a favorite horror comic or show based on this issue?
I have a number. Definitely name off a few. Like, I'm not going to take the one I think you're going to use. There's, well, first and foremost, it's going to be no surprise, Uzumaki by Junji Ito. It's a graphic novel. We've talked about it ad nauseum, so I'm not going to go into it. The Crow that I mentioned already was one of my favorite just stories of all time, kind of thing. And a third one that I'm pretty sure Steph is going to mention. And if she doesn't, then I'll come back to it. So, Steph, what's yours?
I think they're all the ones I mentioned on the graphic novels episode, if you want to give that a listen, but I will just gush about them here again. I absolutely loved The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. Was that the one you were going to say?
Nope.
Okay. I loved it. I am really bad at reading follow-ups though, so I was actually thinking to myself that I was going to do my own personal sequel September and check out the volume 2 for all the graphic novels that I love, because I've read volume 1 and I'm like, oh, I'm definitely going to read volume 2. So that Nailbiter was another one I really liked about a serial killer. And oh, I think I know what you were going to say now that I think of it. Lock and Key.
There you go, Mr. Joe Hill.
Yeah, those are good ones. Sandman, also by Neil Gaiman.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, basically, you go back and listen to our graphic novels episode, and you get a lot of insight into it. That's more or less most of what we're saying right now, really.
Yeah, essentially. I need to branch out and read more graphic novels, which I think is what I want to do next month.
And the last question for this episode comes from Emily Craddock, and that is, what other genres do you read? Also, what are some underrated horror movies you think more people should watch?
I read a lot of other genres. I like a good old like classic locked room mystery. Like I really like Agatha Christie. Thrillers have been a little hit or miss for me, but I do enjoy a good thriller every now and then. Historical fiction. I try to read at least a few classics a year. Literary fiction is one I really haven't picked up actually in like 2 years, but I used to really like it. I guess one specific subgenre of literary fiction that I will always pick up is a multi-generational family saga. Like if you're telling me a story and it follows a family through at least 3 generations, I am there. And then as for some underrated horror movies I think more people should watch, I really liked The Invitation. It's on Netflix, and it's about this guy he and his girlfriend get invited to his ex-wife's dinner party that she is hosting with her new husband. So, not an awkward situation at all. And things get tense. I also really liked, I think I've mentioned it on the podcast, but The Black Coat's Daughter, and that stars Emma Roberts and, ooh, what's her name? The girl that plays Sabrina on the new Sabrina show. She was Sally Draper on Mad Men. Kiernan Shipka, that's her name. And it's about these girls that are at this private Catholic high school, and they stay in their dorm for a few days after winter break has started, and stuff happens. I know it's like I can't really tell you what it's about. And lastly, I know Devin and I talked about this I think a few episodes ago, but Sinister I don't think gets enough love.
Again, since joining the podcast, not a whole lot of other genres. But prior to that, and still going forward, I'm looking to re-manage my time and try and get more reading done. I've always been one to read pretty much everything, and I know this is a bit of a cop-out of an answer, but like legitimately, but when it comes to me and reading, I'm generally more about like the experience of it, what you can pull from it, what you can get out of it, not even necessarily the story itself. That's why, again, as I alluded to earlier about the group I used to have on BookTube called Are We Not Entertained, the point was, what can you like pull from a story? What experiences can you go through with the story, whether it's good, bad? Within that group, I've read The Selection by Kiera Cass. I've read Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. I've read The Road. I've read Stephanie Meyer. I've been all over the spectrum on this. So I generally will read anything within any genre whatsoever, as long as it sounds really good or really bad. In terms of underrated horror movies, the first one comes to mind is Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. It's a mockumentary of this slasher who's setting up for his big night of killing, innocent teens and following the rules and such. Very Scream-esque meets the Blair Witch, I guess. I don't know. Another one, which isn't a horror movie, but it is an actual documentary that I think people should check out if you haven't already, is, I'm pretty sure it's on Shudder, is Never Sleep Again, the Nightmare on Elm Street documentary. It's like 4 hours long, but it like goes into such detail about the creation of the movie, and its impact and such. I can't recommend that enough. Terrifier is another movie. It's on Netflix, which is developing this massive cult following now, but that's a movie that I'd recommend getting in on it now, especially before it becomes this cult classic that everyone's talking about 10 years from now, 15 years from now that you didn't see. And the last one, a little more odd, is the movie, I think Steph, if she hasn't seen it, would really enjoy it. As Above, So Below. It's very Descent-ish. It's basically these tourists go into under Paris. There's these catacombs, and it's like miles and miles and miles of catacombs. And if you get lost on there, you could legitimately never be found again. That's how like intricate they are. And this is a movie it's a found footage movie of people going down and hilarity ensuing as bad things happen to them while they get lost within the catacombs.
That is our question and answer episode, guys. Thank you so much for taking the time to submit questions. We will be back to a regular Books in the Freezer episode next time in the next 2 weeks.
And like I said, that was all the time we have today for the questions. If you did submit a question and it wasn't asked, don't fret. Like I said, we are going to hold on to them. This won't be the last Q&A episode that we do, so it is possible. Or we might even be able to answer some, privately, like on social media or other means.
Books in the Freezer is a bi-weekly podcast. We post episodes every other Tuesday. You can find us on Twitter at BooksFreezerPod or on Instagram at BooksInTheFreezer. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/BooksInTheFreezer. You can send us an email at booksinthefreezer@gmail.com. Show notes for this episode and all previous episodes will be at booksinthefreezer.com. I'm Stephanie. You can find me on Twitter at lady_Ganya. That's LADY_GHENON. Or on Instagram at That's What She Read, but that's with 2 A's. Or on YouTube at That's What She Read, just spelled normally.
And I'm Devin. You can find me on Twitter at InsomniReads. And you can also find me streaming horror games on Twitch at Indie Insomniac.
Join us next time for Books in the Freezer.